So hello everyone. Um, it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this first webinar of this new concept. This Young Professionals webinar series is a new initiative that aims to provide a platform for young professionals in the field of hydro environment engineering and research to connect, collaborate, and learn from each other. So the primary goal of this series is to help establish a good collaborative framework among the existing young professionals networks and identify some topics of common interest and build a forum of exchange where all the young professionals can meet, discuss, and talk about different issues in their areas of expertise. So we aim to provide an excellent opportunity for all the young professionals to engage with each other, share their knowledge and experience. And these webinars will focus on the various topics related to the industry, such as research topics, technology, policy, and management. So before starting with this webinar, I will want to introduce our first speaker. And I will remind you that all the participants can write all the questions on the Q&A chat that you have on the bottom of your screen. So it's my pleasure to introduce our distinguished speaker for today's webinar, Emanuele Quadranta. Emanuele is a civil engineering with experience in the field of hydraulic engineering. He has worked on several projects related to the water energy ecosystem nexus with focus on hydropower systems, nature-based solutions, and wastewater. And he also has published several research papers on these topics. So, Emmanuel, I will pass the word to you. I will share the screen for your presentation. You have more or less 20 minutes, 25 minutes for your presentation. I hope you all see the screen.
Yeah, yes, thank you, Francisco. I can see it. Okay, I can start. Thank you very much for inviting me to talk at this webinar. I am Emanuele Quarant. I work at the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. My task is to perform scientific assessment, in this case on hydropower, in order to support the policy-making process. Next slide, please. Here is a short summary of my presentation. We talk about the complexity around the hydropower sector. Then we talk about the implication that this complexity generates, and then some slides about the innovation in the European Union. Next slide. So what is hydropower? Just a brief introduction. Hydropower converts the energy of water into electricity thanks to the rotation of a turbine and an electric generator. Next slide. We can distinguish different types of hydropower. On one hand, we have large hydropower, typically with installed power above 10 megawatt. And within large hydropower, we have hydropower plant with reservoir and also run-of-the-river hydropower plants without storage capacity or with a little storage capacity. Next slide. On the other hand, we have a small hydropower. The small hydropower are power plant typically below 10 megawatt, then depends on definition in each country, but 10 megawatt is more or less the common target, to say the common threshold. And typically small hydropower plants are developed, for example, in existing barriers, in mills, in water and wastewater distribution network, but can also be built in as a new plants in rivers. Next slide. Here you can see the role of hydropower in the world. We can see that hydropower, the electricity generated by hydropower plants, cover more or less 15% of the total global electricity generation. And if we only look at renewable energy technologies, hydropower share is more or less 59%. But together with renewable energy generation, hydropower also provides storage capacity and flexibility. Next slide, please. So hydropower is a very complex system, especially when we talk about big hydropower plants, because when we build a new hydropower plant, especially with a reservoir, we interfere with a lot of Earth spheres. For example, we talk about water, hydrology, hydraulics. We talk about aquatic and terrestrial ecosystem. We generate environmental and social impacts and benefit. We also have to consider the geology, the rock mechanics of the soil around the hydropower plant. We talk about civil, mechanical, and structural engineering. Then we have also all the economy and the operation, for example, of multiple use reservoirs. We talk about new infrastructure, flexibility, financial investment. So you can understand how hydropower is a very comprehensive and cross-cutting topic. Next slide, please. For example, hydropower interferes with the environment and with the hydrosphere, generating both sometimes impact but also benefit. For example, hydropower may hinder fish migration, but this is the problem of any barrier, but can also, thanks to the reservoir, provide new microclimate that can be suitable for the proliferation of new plants, for example. Next slide, please. Hydropower also interacts with the oceans, first of all, by trapping sediment and fish, but hydropower, there is also evidence that hydropower, thanks to the trash rack inside hydropower plants, hydropower also helps in removing plastics from rivers. You have to consider that most of plastics inside the oceans comes from river, but most of plastics that reach the rivers remains inside the river, thanks to the presence of barriers and especially thanks to the role of hydropower in removing these plastics. Another case is, for example, the pumped hydropower storage type, and there is an emerging trend in building the lower reservoir in the ocean. Next slide, please. Then, always talking about hydropower and the ocean, most of energy technologies used to convert the energy of waves, current, and tides into electricity come from the hydropower sector, like, for example, hydrokinetic turbines. Next slide, please. Hydropower also interact with especially water reservoirs in general, interact with the atmosphere by means of the evaporation and sometimes also the greenhouse gas emission from the reservoir. And in the next presentation, Debbie will talk about this more in detail. Next slide, please. Hydropower interacts a lot with society, providing electricity, providing water storage, water needs, also tourism, for example, I would say the trekking around water reservoir. But in some cases, it has also generated, again, I will talk about in general water reservoir rather than just hydropower reservoir. It also generated impacts, for example, when large reservoir has submerged the upstream area, submerging, for example, villages upstream. Next slide, please. Hydropower can be hybridized with other energy sources, for example, with photovoltaics, both as floating photovoltaics on reservoir, but also by installing photovoltaics panel on dam surface. Hydropower can be hybridized with energy, with battery. We can also extract heat from the cooling system of the generator and reusing this heat. So hydropower has a great potential of hybridization also with other technologies. Next slide, please. And you can understand from the previous slides the cross-cutting capability of hydropower. And so therefore, hydropower is at the center of the so-called water energy food ecosystem nexus. Next slide, please. And this complexity of hydropower has several implications, and I will talk more in detail about this implication in the next slide. In particular, I will focus on the debate between benefits and impacts of hydropower. Then I will also show to you some conflictual policies, especially in the European Union, among between the on the cross-border of protection of the environment and renewable energy generators. Sometimes these are conflictual targets. Then we need, so to satisfy all our policy and to achieve the so-called sustainable hydropower, we need a lot of different experts and expertise. The complexity around hydropower sometimes also generate a sort of, I will say, disinformation and the risk of taking a priori position. For example, there are a lot of debate between people who a priori would like to remove whole hydropower barrier, and on the other hand, people that would like to build hydropower everywhere. And we have to find the right compromise among these. That is called sustainable hydropower. Next slide, please. So the first, I will say, implication is the debate between benefit and impact. So on one hand, we have the benefit of hydropower, renewable energy, energy storage, flexibility, water management. Then also we can valorize, for example, the cultural heritage in the water myths. We can create job opportunities, tourism. On the other hand, we may generate impact, like for example, on fish, on sediment, on river fragmentation, on ecosystem. So from these several questions, that are difficult to be answered. The first is how to define the sustainability of hydropower, and maybe in the next presentation we talk about this. Then are more important the benefit on the impact, how to give a value to benefit and impact, and then are you sure that the other renewable energy sources are less impacting? Because my personal feeling is that nowadays a lot of, I would say, people are comparing the impact of hydropower with the benefit of the other renewable. And this is wrong, because we have to consider both benefit and impact of all the technologies. Next slide, please. Here is another example of implication of the complexity around hydropower. For example, relating to policies in the European Union. On one hand, we have, for example, the Water Framework Directive, where hydropower is perceived as a source of impact on ecosystems. On the other hand, we have the Renewable Energy Directive, where hydropower is considered a clean energy technology. And so we need hydropower to decarbonize our system. Then there is the Flood Directive, which is, I would say, in the middle, because in general, barriers and reservoirs, not only the hydropower one, can interfere with the river, so exacerbate floods. But on the other hand, reservoirs can store water, so they can mitigate floods and drought periods. Next slide, please. And so to discuss about this topic, we need a lot of expertise. And in this slide, I summarize just a few of them. For example, you can see geologists, engineers, environmental engineers, ecologists, economists. So we need to be more comprehensive and to talk more among us about all the complexities around hydropower. Next slide, please. So here, I would say the final part of my presentation, I would say the most curious about some disinformation and a priori position held by some, I would say, environmentalists on one hand and energy stakeholder on one hand. These views are typically conflicting. And so in order to find the right compromise among them, we need to develop the so-called sustainable hydropower, which is a sort of trade-off among the different views. Next slide, please. Indeed, sustainable hydropower needs to achieve a good balance between electricity generation, social benefit, and impacts on the ecosystem. And we need to develop mitigation solutions and innovative technologies. And in this presentation, then we will talk about, for example, the hydropower sustainability standard. Next slide, please. This is the first example. For example, and these are all sentences statements that I hear every day. People who always claim that for example, micro hydropower, so very small hydropower plants, are always good because they are small, and so no big dams are needed. But this is not always true, because we have to consider, for example, also the cumulative impact of barriers. And also small hydropower plants can have an impact if they are not developed in a sustainable way. Next slide, please. On the other hand, we have people who claim the opposite, who claim micro hydropower is bad because they are small hydropower, so they generate not significant power and interfere with rivers. But again, this is not always true, because, for example, here there are some examples of small micro hydropower plants developed and very well integrated into urban context and rural context. Next slide, please. Another statement is, for example, the one on hydrokinetic turbines that claim that hydrokinetic turbines are a clean energy source. They do not need a dam and they can be installed in flowing water. So they are sustainable and they are a good strategy. Yes, I would say hydrokinetic turbines do not need dams, but we have calculated that their potential, for example, the European Union is not significant. So we cannot invest so much in hydrokinetic turbine because they could be a good solution in local context, but will not save our energy system. Next slide, please. Here another slide, I took this picture from the report of the project Hydropower Europe that is coordinated by Anton. And for example, another statement that I sometimes hear is that people claim wind and solar energy technologies are better because they do not run fish. Okay, I would say yes, but do not forget about the bird, for example, when we talk about wind energy. And other example could be, for example, you can see the first slide, the carbon emission for kilowatt hours of hydropower are among the lowest one. If we look, for example, at the energy return on investment, in the picture below on the left, we can see that hydropower has the highest value, so it is the most convenient. If we look at the critical material used, hydropower does not use critical material except in very exceptional cases. But for example, solar and wind use a lot of critical material. So we have to be comprehensive, not consider only fish, but we have to consider all the possible interaction of any energy technology with the environment. Next slide, please. Here again, another example of not complete statement is the one that claims hydropower does not consume fuel, thus it is clean. I may say, in part, yes, but some water reservoir, not only hydropower reservoir, can emit also methane and carbon due to the organic decomposition in the reservoir. And Debbie will talk about this in the next presentation. Next slide, please. Another example is this hydropower traps sediments, so generate impact, so it is not sustainable. I will say, yes, it traps sediments, but also, as I said before, trap plastics, and so can help in cleaning rivers. Next slide, please. This is another example. People who claim hydropower is the responsible of river fragmentation. I will say hydropower, yes, can contribute to river fragmentation, but it's not the main responsible. I took this slide from the HyCall database, the elaborate data of HyCall database. You can see here that only 1/3 of hydropower of water reservoir are for poor hydropower. And I can add still this, the Amber database, a European project, identified 600,000 more or less barriers in European rivers, but less than 10% are for hydropower. So the problem of river fragmentation, yes, also depends on hydropower, but hydropower is not the main responsible. Next slide, please. Okay, this is the last part of my presentation. So you can see the complexity of hydropower and so also the difficulty to consider all the possible aspects around hydropower. And for doing this, the European Commission has funded several projects on the sustainability of hydropower. You can see here an example of the millions of euros given to the member state to develop sustainable projects around hydropower. Next slide, please. You can see some output. For example, here is a picture on the number of egg value inventions that are the patented in more than one patenting office. And you can see that the European Union is the best and performs better than also, for example, the United States and China. Next slide, please. Here another slide depicting the industrial innovation in the European Union. You can see on the left the number of innovative companies in different member states. And again, a lot of member states of the European Union are among the top 10 lists, for example, France, Austria, Germany. On the other picture on the right, you can see some companies with egg value inventions. And there are several European companies, like, for example, with Hydro and Hydro, General Electric. Next slide, please. And again, always this context of sustainable hydropower, I am coordinating a research activity at the European Commission in order to identify the potential of sustainable hydropower solution in the European Union, focusing on different strategies that do not involve the construction of new barriers. For example, we identified that by modernization of the existing hydropower fleet, we can add 40, 50 terawatt-hours per year, more than 10% of the hydropower potential. We can develop hydropower, for example, in existing barrier, in existing water mills, adding some terawatt hours per year of energy generation. Again, we can develop hydrokinetic turbines, but as I said before, the potential for hydrokinetic turbine can be good in local context, but it's not, I would say, a European strategy. We can develop hydropower in water distribution network and in wastewater treatment plant, adding 3 terawatt-hours per year, more or less. We can recover heat from the cooling system of a generator, more or less 1% of losses are heat losses, and we can recover heat. We can exploit, again, new existing small barrier irrigation and industrial flow. We can develop floating PV, photovoltaics, on a hydropower reservoir. We can also interconnect existing reservoir to create new pump hydropower storage, adding more or less 29 terawatt-hours of storage, energy storage. We can also power, no power down. There is not a clear assessment on this, but more or less from some preliminary calculation, we can add 10 gigawatt of installed power to non-power downs. Next slide, please. Here are my conclusions. So I show as hydropower is a complex sector, a complex system. And so we need more interaction and different kind of expertise. So please, another take on message, not hold a priori position, because hydropower is very complex and we need to consider a lot of different aspects and always consider all the impacts and the benefit, but not only when talking about hydropower, also when talking about solar, wind, when talking about any energy technology. And then the European Union is a hydropower leader, and this hydropower complexity and debate has been the main driver of knowledge and expertise development of the hydropower sector in the European Union, making European Union companies, projects, institutions, and academy also among the most advanced in the world. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Emmanuel, for your nice presentation and for sharing our perspectives in this very important topic. Now I will present our second speaker of this webinar, Debbie Gray. Debbie is a climate policy manager at the International Hydropower Association with an extensive experience in the field of water resources management and also flood risk management. And with over 20 years of experience in the industry, Debbie has worked in several high-profile projects related to water resources management, hydraulic modeling, and flood risk assessment. So, Debbie, thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much, Francisco, and thank you, Emanuele, for that great introduction to hydropower. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and share my slides. Great. So my name is Debbie Gray. As Francisco mentioned, I'm climate policy manager at an organization called the International Hydropower Association, and we are the voice of sustainable hydropower. I'm going to be talking today about three main things. First of all, my association and the need for more sustainable hydropower. Second of all, our hydropower sustainability standard. And lastly, this phenomenon that Emanuele touched upon about greenhouse gas emissions from reservoir and how can we better evaluate them. So first of all, as an introduction, the IHA is truly a global association. We have over 90 members who are active in about 120 countries. The installed capacity of our members is about 450 gigawatts, which, to put that in perspective, that's about 1/3 of the global capacity of hydropower today. And our mission, which you see on the right, is really to advance sustainable hydropower and to be the voice of the global voice of sustainable hydropower, to ensure that hydropower is part of the solution to climate change and energy security. We do this with engaging with different organizations such as this one, as well as with policymakers, financial decision makers, as well as the general public. Just a glimpse of our members, just to show that we are truly a global organization. The headquarters is based in London. And here you see a sampling of some of our operators as well as their installed capacity. However, our members are not just hydropower operators. We also represent other members of ours are also developers of projects, designers, suppliers, consultants, as well as equipment manufacturers. We have 5 policy and research themes: climate change, which is one that I'm responsible for, as well as sustainability, water management to really promote awareness of the multiple uses of hydropower, which Emanuele touched on very well in his presentation, as well as markets and finance to see how can we unlock more investment for sustainable hydropower. And finally, technology, where we focus a lot of our work actually on modernization of existing hydropower assets. Now, you've been hearing me talk a lot about what we do about promoting sustainable hydropower. And you might ask the question, well, why do we need more hydropower? It's an old technology. Don't we already have a lot in Europe as well as in other places of the world? Well, the answer is yes, we do, if we're going to meet our net zero targets. And it's not actually just me or the IHA who is saying that. Both IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, as well as the IEA, the International Energy Agency, both of these agencies have done modeling. They've looked at what does the electricity system have to look like in the future if we're going to meet our net zero targets. So the chart that you see on the right here is modeling done from IRENA and their scenario, their transforming energy scenario, which is intended to limit global warming to less than 2 degrees C. And there are two really striking things about this chart. First of all, they looked at the electricity sector in 2017, and then they projected to the future, what should the electricity sector look like in 2050 if we're going to meet that goal? And it's really striking to me, first of all, that we're going to need more electricity. Now, why would that be? Well, because we're talking about reducing fossil fuels, which means getting fossil fuels out of the total energy mix, not just out of the electricity sector, but we're talking about electrifying end uses, such as transportation, buildings, as well as industry. So we're going to need more electricity, number one. Number two, that electricity has to come from low carbon sources. So if you see the difference in the light blue line, which is wind, between 2017 and 2050, there's a huge increase in the amount of wind which has to come online, as well as the amount of solar, the yellow bar here, which has to come online. But it might not be super obvious by this graph, but if we focus in on the third largest sector of electricity, that is actually going to be hydroelectricity. And they're actually talking, to put it in numbers, we need at least another 850 gigawatts by 2050. Now, hydropower has always been providing a baseload electricity to many electrical grids around the world. And it also has this great capability, is that reservoir storage can provide storage capability. So hydropower's role is going to increasingly shift from being one of just providing baseload electricity to more and more providing the storage capability to enhance system flexibility. And why is that important? Well, because when there's a lot of wind, perhaps too much wind, hydropower is a great way of storing that energy. And then when the wind isn't blowing, for example, then the hydropower dams can release that water and generate more electricity. So when we're talking about having system flexibility and supporting variable wind and solar, that is hydropower's capacity of being able to store electricity and then release it when it's needed. Just some more numbers for you. Looking at global hydropower installed capacity, you can see that the about half of the total capacity is by the four countries you see here, which it's not a big surprise, but the top five are the 5 largest countries in the world. So those are the countries which have access to a large hydro resource. So if we look at the total installed capacity today is about 1,300 gigawatts. And IHA, we keep a detailed database of hydropower plants, including planned projects as well as those in construction. So we have, if you add up the construction and the pre-construction, about 560, let's say, gigawatts. Now, I said earlier that IRENA is saying that we need 850 gigawatts, but we only have about 550 or 560 in the pipeline. So even if all of the projects in the pipeline are developed, it still leaves a 300 gigawatt gap to meet global climate targets. Who's developing hydropower today? I think it's pretty obvious from this graph that China is far and away the company which develops hydropower at the most rapid pace. To put these numbers in perspective, China added in 2021 about 21,000 megawatts or 21 gigawatts. The installed capacity, hydropower capacity of Italy is about 22 gigawatts. France is about 25. So just to put that number in perspective, China added in 2021 almost the equivalent of Italy or France. And Italy and France have been developing hydropower for decades and decades. That sort of puts it in scale how much China is developing. It's not the only country developing, of course. Canada, where I am from, is still building new greenfield, and as well as several countries in Asia, particularly, as well as in Brazil. Now, I've been talking a lot about sustainable hydropower, so you might rightly ask, well, what do you mean exactly by sustainable hydropower? And Emanuele touched on this as well. And as he promised, I'll be talking about the Hydropower Sustainability Standard. The Hydropower Sustainability Standards was launched in 2021. And basically, it provides guidelines and tools to assess environmental, social, and governance performance of a hydropower project at various stages. That means it can be applied either to a project in its design phase or to a project which is even in its operating stage. It's developed and governed by a multi-stakeholder council, so it's not a product of the IHA per se. IHA has been supporting it and has sparked its development, but it's not technically an IHA project. It's aligned with other ESG rules, such as those of the World Bank or the International Finance Corporation. And the sustainability team also has a training academy where they provide training to for companies that want to report on projects or want to learn how to make their projects more sustainable. So what are the principles of sustainability? Well, there are 12 criteria, which you see here. I'm not going to go through them one by one, but I just wanted to point out that when we talk about sustainability, we're not just talking about environmental impact. Sure, there are some criteria related to biodiversity and invasive species, water quality and sediments, which are the environmental impacts, the most obvious ones, which Emanuele spoke about as well. But it also includes some criteria related to social, for example, in resettlement, working conditions, as well as a specific criteria related to Indigenous people. The Hydropower Sustainability Standard was launched in 2021, but that came on the heels of a whole suite of other documents or a lot of other work which had been started 10 or 15 years even before that. The predecessor to the standard was something called the Hydropower Sustainability Assessment Protocol, which some of you may be familiar with, which was developed again with a multi-stakeholder background. You see that prominent environmental groups such as the World Wildlife Fund as well as the Nature Conservancy were involved in the development of the original protocol, and they're still involved with the governance of the standard today. So if we see here on the right, who governs the standard? IHA serves as a secretariat to a governance committee, which is composed of 7 what we call chambers, and these chambers represent different stakeholders, for example, financial institutions, the hydropower suppliers and operators, developed and developing country governments, and finally social and environmental NGOs. So it truly is a multi-stakeholder group which governs the standard, and I think that's one of its strengths, that we were able to bring in the input of these different stakeholders. And I'm happy to say that the very first project was certified very recently, just on Water Day, the 22nd of March, 2023. The first certified plant was the Sebsor Hydropower project. This is a project located in Tajikistan. So now for the last part of my presentation, I'm going to be talking about greenhouse gas emissions from reservoirs. Emanuele touched on it a little bit. He said that when land is flooded during the creation of a reservoir, that the carbon in the flooded land will decompose to form carbon dioxide or CO2, as well as methane, CH4. These gases are released to the atmosphere through the 4 pathways that you see here in this little diagram. So if this is the dam, this is the reservoir, the 4 pathways are bubbling. CH4, methane, is hydrophobic. It does not really like water. It does not dissolve all that well. So when methane tends to accumulate in the sediments of the shallow parts of the reservoir, and then it forms bubbles which are released to the atmosphere. Diffusive flux of both CO2 and CH4 is dissolved gases which travel through the water column and are released from the surface to the atmosphere. And these phenomena, by the way, are common to all reservoirs, of course, not just hydropower reservoirs. Finally, the last pathway, which is specific to hydropower, is degassing. So what happens is there tends to be, in certain circumstances only, an accumulation of methane at the bottom of the reservoir. And when the water is passed through the turbines, then this methane can be released in what is called degassing. So those are the 4 pathways of how of what are the 2 compounds which are created, and then how are they released to the atmosphere. And there are different factors which affect the amount of carbon dioxide and methane. Has to do with climate, soil properties, the amount of shallow area, as well as the water intake depth. So in order, we've known about this phenomenon for many, many years. Now, in order to evaluate just how much CO2 and methane is released, is it even really significant? Because the degradation of soil and of carbon and the generation of methane and CO2, those are natural processes which have been going on Earth long before reservoirs were ever created. So in order to evaluate what is the quantity, IHA with a number of partners, which you see here, developed a tool called the GRES tool. So what it is, it's a simple to use, free, web-based tool, which allows a user to evaluate the greenhouse gas emissions from reservoirs. It was launched in May 2017. And the GRES tool team provides a number of services, including certified user training for those who are interested and would like to use the tool correctly. We offer both virtual and in-person training. As well, we can validate the results of a user who has evaluated the reservoir emissions. The step is required and very necessary to make sure that your results are robust. And finally, we can provide assessment of reservoir if there's an owner or operator who wants to evaluate the emissions from their reservoir, but they don't want to take the training and do it themselves. We offer the service of doing it for them. So more information can be found at the website you see there. Just a quick note, which might interest this group about the background, the scientific background of the development of the tool. We've known about the phenomenon of reservoirs releasing greenhouse gases for quite a while, and there's a conceptual paper which sort of brought together all the knowledge. This was in 2017, which sort of set the framework for the GRES tool to be developed, based on a literature review of 223 reservoirs, because basically around that time as well, a lot of reservoir operators were starting to take like direct sampling and measuring the amounts of gases coming from the surface of their reservoirs or in the water column. So there was a literature review to look at the different characteristics of the reservoirs. From that came the development of empirical models, and those empirical models were the basis of the GRES tool. So basically, just to reiterate, it's an easy to use, free online tool, and behind it are mathematical empirical models based on science. Some general trends about greenhouse gas emissions from reservoirs. There's a bit of some myths out there. I've even seen some headlines saying hydro dams are bad because they emit more CO2 than coal. Well, that is not exactly true. The story is, of course, like many things, more nuanced than that. So you see this map are the results of about 5,000 reservoirs, and the results are presented in a grams for CO2 equivalent per square meter per year. So it's not related to energy production. On this slide, it's related really to the reservoir emissions themselves. And so there are some general trends, and you can see that typically in colder parts of the world, like in boreal regions, like in Northern Europe or in Canada, there tend to be fewer greenhouse gases emitted per square meter, whereas in hotter parts of the world, the emissions tend to be a little bit higher. But if you see the zoom here in the Iberian Peninsula, you can see that there are some reservoirs with relatively high emissions right next to some reservoirs with very low emissions. So this really brings home the importance of doing a site-specific assessment and not characterizing. To show you some more results, okay, this graph might look a little bit confusing, so I'll try to walk you through it without taking up too much time. But on the x-axis here, we have the allocated greenhouse gas emissions intensity. That is the grams of CO2 per unit of energy produced. So for electricity, we're talking about kilowatt hours. So what are the grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour over the full life cycle of a hydropower project? On the y-axis, we have power density. Power density means what is the watts, so the installed capacity of power per square meter of flooded land. For a long time, the power density was used sort of as a proxy of the impact of reservoirs. In other words, the thinking was that if there's a V-shaped reservoir, so a very small amount of land was flooded for a very large amount of energy, then the impact is going to be relatively lower, specifically as it relates to greenhouse gas emissions. Whereas a very shallow reservoir, a very wide reservoir with a lower energy will probably have more emissions. So power density used to be used quite often as a proxy for the greenhouse gas emissions. That's why we plotted it on our graph here. All the colored dots, those are the results of an assessment done on 500 reservoirs. And you can see that most of them are below the typical threshold of 100 grams per kilowatt hour over the lifetime. However, there are some outliers. Now, Emanuele really explained well the difference of comparing all aspects of renewable generation sources and not just killing fish. And one of the things he spoke about was the climate change impacts. So I thought it might be interesting to share with you some results from the IPCC, which are slightly different from those mentioned in Emanuele, but it shows the same general trend. basically the median of greenhouse gas emissions per kilowatt hour for hydro is about 24. Solar is a bit higher at 48. Wind is a bit lower at 12. And then if you want to plot natural gas, it goes beyond the scale of my particular chart here. It'd be about 490. And if we're talking about coal, we're talking about going in the 800s. So this shows that even though there are some outliers, most hydropower is actually low carbon. Finally, recognition of the GRES tool, a certain number of taxonomies, including the EU taxonomy, the ASEAN taxonomy, as well as the Climate Bonds Initiative, which provides financing for low carbon projects. When they are giving their criteria for hydropower projects, they say that they must be low carbon, and they point to the GRES tool as a valid means of determining the greenhouse gas emissions. So this shows that the GRES tool, which has been around for about 6-7 years now, has gained a lot of credibility within the scientific community. Finally, and this is my last slide, as you might have noticed in my background, the IHA, we're holding World Hydropower Congress starting October 31st in Bali in Indonesia. We're aiming to bring together over 1,000 decision makers and other stakeholders from the hydropower sector. And we invite all of you to come and to join us at the Congress. And we will be having a workshop specifically on greenhouse gas emissions and other sessions specifically on sustainability. So for more information, you can go to this website or contact me after. So thank you very much for your attention. I hope I didn't go over my time too much.
David, thank you very much for your pragmatic and dynamic presentation with very nice content regarding this topic. So now it's time to open the discussion, the roundtable of questions. Then I will pass the word to the moderators, Anton from the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne, and Danielle from the Karlsruhe Institute of Technology. And now Daniel and Anton, the floor is yours. And I see that you have some few questions. And now let's open the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Debbie and Emanuele. So you gave us a very detailed information on hydropower, also a lot of information regarding complexity. In principle, you said to reach, let's say, the net zero target in the world, we have to more than double the capacity of hydropower compared to today. That's what I have seen, and what is also confirmed by a lot of other studies. Now, what do you think, and that's also a question for Emanuele, how we can bring that to reality to double the capacity of hydropower in the world? What are, let's say, the critical issues which have to be addressed to make this project successful? Perhaps Debbie first.
Yeah, I was wondering if Emanuele wanted to reply first. There are several things. Thanks very much for that question. First of all, getting hydropower, educating policymakers about the value of hydropower and all of the services that it provides. As I said in my presentation, we're going to need a lot more wind and a lot more solar, but we're also going to need hydropower as the renewable energy technology, which can provide firm energy. So when you start talking about firm energy and ancillary services and grid services and making sure the grid is stable, I'm not sure that the policymakers fully understand what we mean by that. People in the electricity sector they know what that means, but I'm not sure that policymakers really understand that, because in many markets today, electricity is just rewarded for the energy. That is, the company provides 1 kilowatt hour. Well, they get paid, 5 cents or 10 cents or a few euros or whatever it is in that market. So they're just rewarded for the energy that is provided. It is not they're not typically rewarded for the other services. That is the fact that they are dispatchable. Dispatchable means that the electricity is ready to go, is ready to be sold the second that you need it, because one of the particularities of electricity is the supply always has to exactly match the demand. So that is one main thing, educating policymakers to the full value of hydropower, including all of these other services that hydropower can provide. And making sure that those services are rewarded by financial mechanisms. Another big challenge, of course, is sustainability. I mean, I spoke about it a lot. That is why IHA, with all these stakeholders, have developed the hydropower sustainability standard. And we firmly believe that going forward, there's no excuse not to develop sustainable hydropower. We have the know-how. We have 100 years of lessons learned from the sector. So there's no excuse not to do hydropower sustainably. And that sentence of going forward, the only power should be sustainable hydropower. That is from what we call the San Jose Declaration. So that is a declaration signed at our Congress in 2021. It was signed by IHA members, but also by a number of other stakeholders. So it really is we have buy-in from the wider community that going forward, the only good hydropower is sustainable hydropower. So those are the two key challenges: educating policymakers, three, I guess: educating policymakers, financial mechanisms, and sustainability.
Okay, thank you very much. Emanuele, you want perhaps to add?
Thank you very much. Another important thing to consider, for example, for the European Union, but in general, is that climate changes in the future will change the hydrology of rivers. So we will need more water storage to compensate this hydrological changing. And so water reservoir that we need for water issues, not for energy issues, could also be used for energy storage. In the so-called water energy nexus. Then, yes, we have to increase hydropower capacity to decarbonize our system, because we need storage and we need flexibility provided by hydropower. And first of all, we should give priority to the solution that give more benefit and multiple uses, and that can be used for multiple uses. For example, I say the hydropower modernization can generate a lot of benefit, not only because we increase energy generation, but because we also increase resilience. We also increase adaptation to climate changes, flexibility. Then we can also tap hidden hydropower opportunities in existing infrastructure, and also to give value to local sources of energy and to local value of what we do. And then obviously, we have to find this compromise, but this is valid for all renewable energy. And this is a concept that now policymakers are starting to understand, that we do not have to only focus, for example, on energy target, but when trying to reach energy target, we also have to consider the environmental implication of all energy technologies.
Thank you very much, Emanuele. You brought a word into the play, which in principle is very important to mention: multi-purpose use. I think, let's say the hydropower projects, they are successful if they are designed as multi-purpose projects. I think you agree, they be not only producing electricity and other services for electricity, like flexibility and of course long-term storage, but as Emanuele mentioned, it's also a contribution to Sustainable Development Goals and the Nexus, let's say, goals. So that's the multi-purpose use of the hydropower reservoirs. And I'm convinced personally, only in future, of course, sustainable projects are successful, but mainly projects which have a multi-purpose use, which allow to produce a kind of a win-win situation between a lot of other stakeholders. So my question is, do you think that the new hydropower project can even increase the biodiversity locally compared to the situation today? What do you think, Debbie?
Yes, I'm from Canada, and specifically from the province of Quebec, which has about 95% of our electricity comes from hydropower. So I can't answer on a global basis, but I can provide a local answer. After a reservoir is created and land is flooded, this provides a sort of we've seen a sort of like a sudden growth of certain species of fish, because all of this new food source is available. So this is a very local, and it's actually a bit of a temporary phenomenon, but that's this new space for fish which are adaptable between river and lake conditions. Certain species can live in both quite happily. And so they have this, there's like a baby boom, I would say, after the reservoir is created, because there is a new surface area. Their home just got larger, and there's more of a food source. So that's a very that's one very local example, and I don't think it can. I'm not sure if that's true in other parts of the world. I wonder if Emanuele might have some other examples from a European context.
Yeah, I think
there are a lot of projects which allow really to create more biodiversity locally, to create new wetlands in combination with mitigation measures around reservoirs, and of course also improving, let's say, reservoir river connectivity, also reducing sedimentation problems. So there is a lot of possibility. I think, Emanuele, you can also confirm that.
Yeah, I think that the situation is very site-specific. You know, in some cases, obviously, we can generate impact, but in other cases, if we adopt a mitigation solution, and already from the preliminary design stage, we plan to implement mitigation solution and innovative solution, we can also improve the general situation.
Yeah, I think there is another problem of this gas house emission. So it's always the question, what is the reference situation? Perhaps, Debbie, you can briefly explain.
Sure. And what the GRES tool does is it looks at the pre-impoundment emissions and then the post-impoundment emissions. So the reference situation is really the pre-impoundment. So typically there is a river and there is a forest, and then that land is now being converted into a reservoir. And in some situations, it was a net carbon sink, meaning that the forest typically would absorb more carbon than was emitted. And in other situations, when there are a lot of peats or wetlands, the surrounding area was actually a net carbon emitter. So the reference situation is what was it like in the natural conditions beforehand. And what's interesting about the GRES tool is it gives you the net emissions, that is the future, the emissions with a reservoir minus the emissions that were there beforehand. And in some places of the world, actually, in some specific reservoirs, the creation of a reservoir results in a net carbon sink. In other words, the reservoir absorbs more carbon than what had been emitted previously.
Yeah, so if you compare it with the wetland, of course, the wetland has a very high biodiversity, but the wetland also, there is quite a large emission of house gases. So,
yes,
of course, when you are looking, let's say, on this gas house emission, okay, the reservoir, especially if they are in hot areas and tropical areas, they can have a quite large emission. But very often, the reservoir, in principle, has also the purpose to store water for irrigation and, let's say, drinking water. Now, if you would, so that the reservoir in principle fulfills a need of water supply. Now, if you go to the agriculture, which fulfills the need of, let's say, that everybody has enough meat or whatever cereal to eat, then of course the agriculture has also a huge emission of gas house. So it's if you compare then a reservoir, drinking water, gas house emission, and agriculture, then let's say the comparison would be completely different. Do you agree?
Yes, effectively.
So
yes.
I think that's important that we compare with all gas house emission. Then perhaps, Debbie, I think the sustainability standard is an important tool.
I think
already some let's say procedure in use. I'm not environmental assessment impact study, but also social studies. How you see the standard, sustainable standard, compared to these already well-established studies, which are, of course, are mainly done in, I would say, developed countries?
You cut out for part of it, but I think I understood your question. I'm just going to repeat it to make sure. How does the standard fit in specifically in countries which have very well-developed processes and regulatory requirements for environmental and social impact? That's a good question. And basically what we're trying to do is we've already aligned our standard with the World Bank guidelines, for example, and we're trying to work with the World Bank and other institutions so that the standard can become complementary to those institutions sort of in-house environmental and social procedures. So those examples, in other words, a project which has been certified would not have to necessarily go through the full environmental and social procedures of the lending institution, because the certification by the standard would sort of be the guarantee that the project is sustainable. So we're working with those institutions to have the standard recognized as such. So that example is probably more applicable, I would say, for developing countries. In terms of developed countries, there is still a need for the standard. I firmly believe that. And in fact, the next project in the pipeline is in my backyard. It's the East Main project in Quebec, Canada. Having the certification is an internationally recognized stamp of approval.
I think that's important. It's a kind of a certification.
Because Quebec has its laws, Canada has its laws, Italy will have its laws, Spain. So every country has its own laws. But the beauty of the standard is that it's applicable globally. And so it's an internationally recognized stamp of approval. And this is helpful not only for seeking funding for certain projects, seeking like green financing, for example. I mentioned the Climate Bonds Initiative as well, which does recognize the tools which predated the standard. So it recognizes that process, but also even in a country, for example, again, I'll speak about Canada because that's what I know, having the sort of international stamp of approval, it's also a way of showcasing the good practices which have been put into place.
Maybe, Anton, if I may,
maybe we could. Sorry, Daniel, we can have a look on questions we have online.
Thanks for keeping the discussion so alive, and thanks Emmanuel and Debbie for the very interesting talks. I would like to raise a few questions from the chat box. I see that both Emmanuel and Debbie have already answered a few, but I will pick a few ones and maybe you can provide your expertise so the audience can also benefit or throw their own particular questions. So there are a few questions on maritime hydropower. We have something on wave converters, and we also have tidal energy, and maybe if the situation in terms of greenhouse gas emissions is better than conventional hydropower. Maybe Debbie and then Emmanuel.
Yes, I mean, looking at the question.
Yeah, I didn't quite capture the question either.
Yes,
I know.
yes, we had questions about wave energy converters. How do you see these in the future if they are more expensive? And we also have in the context maybe of tidal energy, if greenhouse gas emissions are not so bad or are lesser than in conventional hydropower.
Yes, if I may start, for example, on tidal energy, we can exploit two different technologies. The one is the first is the one which exploit the kinetic energy of tidals, and typically there we use hydrokinetic turbines. The other is the technology which exploit the head difference generated in tidal. These are generally few meters, so low head hydropower converters are typically used. And one, I would say, benefit, one pro of tidal energy is that we do not need to build a new reservoir because the reservoir is the ocean, is the sea. But these are still, I would say, emerging technologies, and their potential, their installed potential is growing. Now I don't have here the data, but I have data on the European Union. So if someone is interested, can contact me and I can send data about the European Union situation on tidal and wave energy. Now I don't have it here in my mind, but here then.
It's mainly the Alpheus project, which is looking a little bit for this offshore island pumped storage, which is an interesting concept in a region where there is not the topography available, let's say, to build reservoirs on different elevation. But of course, in the Alps, for example, there are existing a lot of lakes which are already there, which you can interconnect easily to make pumps. So that's, but it's an interesting concept in the ocean.
Debbie, would you like to add any comment to Emmanuel's?
No, I'll have to admit we don't really follow the wave or tidal ocean industry at all. So I'm sorry, I don't have anything to add to what Emanuele said.
It's good. There's another question, if I may raise from my colleague in the that was answered in the chat, but maybe you can expand a bit more. Can methane generated during organic decomposition reservoir be also harnessed as renewable energy? Emmanuel already replied briefly, but I don't know if you can expand a little bit on that.
Yes, there are some technologies under development. For example, the one developed by Blue Methane company, which is aiming at exploiting, at recover the degassing methane downstream of the turbines. And so then the methane, yes, could be transported and used for energy generation, but it is still at the beginning in that research and development phase. If I have maybe Debbie.
I was going to, I saw your answer. I was going to answer the same thing, because IHA, we've just recently started working with blue methane to identify the highest methane producing reservoirs and see if they would be amenable to doing more in situ testing, as well to eventually be able to deploy blue methane's technology. Another solution, the question specifically asked about capturing the methane, and that is a great answer related to blue methane's technology. But there are other things that can be done to reduce the methane emitted from reservoirs. If it's a case where there's a lot of degassing, so that's the methane at the bottom of the reservoirs. If it's in some cases, it might be possible to adjust the water intake, especially in hydropower projects which are not yet built, or to have floating water intake. So the water intake is above the thermocline, which is the thermal layer which keeps the methane low. That is one way of reducing it, or just even reducing the height of the reservoir. Sometimes just by less than a meter can greatly reduce the amount of shallow area around the edge of the reservoir, and that can have a big impact. So there are other things that can be done to reduce the amount of methane generated.
All right, thank you very much both. I also have a question, but that's from myself, if I have time, maybe. We've seen quite some development of pumped hydropower storage in the past few years, also accompanied by wind and solar because of the reduction of costs. And these technologies are very complementary, right? Wind, solar, and pumped hydropower storage. I was wondering if there's any technology in development right now that could take a share of the market of storage. Is there any competition in the next 5-10 years?
Sure, I can take that. I mean, pump storage has been around since the 1960s, or at least the 1970s. And interestingly, it was in the United States, it was developed a lot as a complement to nuclear energy, because you cannot turn off a nuclear power plant at night. So they would use the excess energy to pump in pump storage. So pump storage is certainly not a new technology. It's been around for decades. In terms of competition, of course, everyone was talking about storage is talking about batteries, and the battery technology has been, greatly improved over the past few years. But one thing IHA tends to say, well, we have nothing against batteries, but don't forget, we have this great solution where the technology is known and has some of the fewer challenges in certain areas, specifically regarding resource extraction than batteries do. As well, the advantage of pump storage is it can provide days or even weeks of storage. Whereas my knowledge of batteries, I think it's limited to perhaps less than 24 hours of storage. So pump storage can provide a longer storage timelines, as well as provide some of the inertial requirements that are needed for grids. So yes, there are other storage, like there's also compressed air and flywheels, which I don't know a lot about, but I guess our role is sort of to remind people, like, instead of looking at the latest, greatest storage technology, don't forget the old one, which has been working very well for the past 50 years, is still very valid.
Yes, and
again, we can have to say the water is there in the reservoir, and which can be used for other things. Multiple uses. Not only for produce electricity. So the storage in the water is also important, let's say, to overcome drought periods, for example, which is the case in many these pumped storage which are in operation. And in Europe, there is now a renaissance. So there is a lot of projects which are ready to be built. And the market is now interesting because the energy prices have increased because of this well-known crisis we have now because of the war in Ukraine. So in principle, from an economical point of view, almost every project which has been planned somewhere would be now interesting to be built. But of course, there are some barriers still to overcome.
Thanks, thanks both.
We have others. I don't have.
Yes, we have a few more questions. I don't think we have time for all, but maybe if I can share the last one. We have a question coming from Ethiopia, asking about new methodologies or approaches to assess impact of climate change on large reservoirs. And I know IHA has a guideline, I think from 2019 for that. But maybe you want to share more insights.
Yes, specifically for measurement, you answered the question very well. IHA and UNESCO published a guideline on that several years ago on what is the best methodology for doing so.
Emmanuel, from the European perspective?
Yeah, what we are seeing that in the north of Europe, we will have an increased water availability in the future, while in the south of Europe, we will have a decrease in water availability. So potentially we can increase the energy generation from hydropower in the north, but it may reduce in the south of Europe. And so for this motivation, also new reservoir would be useful, but also the heightening of the dam could be a solution to increase storage capacity if it is possible.
Thanks. Thank you both. I think we are a bit late on time, so I will pass the word to Francisco again. If Francisco can.
If I may add a few comments,
Yes.
I see that there are other questions that we are not able now to answer, but if there are some questions to me, people can write an email to me and I will answer their questions.
Yes, and thanks again, Emmanuel and Debbie, for sharing your time today. I think that's very generous of you, and I think everybody appreciates, and also thank you for already answering many of the questions in the chat.
So thank you very much for this nice discussion and roundtable of questions. I just would like to thank you all, the participants, to attend this event. I would like to thank to the guest speakers for their very nice presentations and the clear and dynamic content that they brought for this webinar. Also, thank you very much for the organizing team to make this first webinar happen, and I hope we can keep this momentum and prepare the following webinars. And I invite you all to submit new proposals regarding your topic of interest is. And I also want to highlight two special sessions that are going to happen in the World Congress in Vienna. The first one is going to be on the introduction of the WFE Nexus to Central Asia, focusing on sustainable development of small hydropower. The second one is going to be Vienna Industry Stream event. So you are all invited to attend the World Congress. I hope we meet all there. And if I not see you all before in another webinar, see you in Vienna. And it was very nice to have you all here attending this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you to IHR for the invitation and for the opportunity.
Bye-bye. And don't forget the better hydropower for a better world.
Yes.
That's our vision.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very
Bye.
much.